Hi, guys. Today you're going to hear a story that is really, really old, that's been around for a long, long time, long before you were born, long before your parents were born, and even before your grandparents were born. The story is about a shoemaker who is a man who makes shoes. These days, shoes are made in factories by machines. A long time ago, though, people called shoemakers made shoes by hand. They used tools and leather to make shoes for people to wear. Shoemakers make shoes on his workbench. A workbench is a special table with places for tools and leather needed to make shoes. People also use workbenches for doing other things like building things out of wood. This man is using his workbench to hold his tool so he can make and fix things. In the story that we're going to read today, you're going to hear about the shoemaker and the elves. The characters in this story are the shoemaker and his wife. Characters are the people a story is about. There are also some secret magical characters in this story. So I want you to listen carefully to the shoemaker and the elves to see if you can guess who those characters might be. Once upon a time, a shoemaker and his wife lived in a village or town. They were kind and honest people who worked hard each day to make fine leather shoes from start to finish. The shoemaker cut the leather, here's the leather right here, into pieces and sewn them together to make each shoe. Then his wife would place each pair in the shop window for sale. Although they had once lived a comfortable life, they had recently become poor. They did not have much money. They worried that they didn't have enough food to eat. The shoemaker had only enough leather left to make one pair of shoes. The shoemaker desperately hoped he could sell his last pair of shoes. He needed to make enough money to buy food for dinner. So the shoemaker began to cut the leather to make the shoes. When he had finished, he set it down on the workbench. He had forgotten how late it was, so he decided to sew the shoes together in the morning. How does the wife look in the picture? She looks a little worried. Why do you think she's worried? He hugged his wife and went to bed. Early the next morning, the shoemaker woke up. He got ready to sew his last pair of shoes. When he got to his workbench, his eyes fell upon the most beautiful pair of shoes he had ever seen. The shoemaker puzzled over who could have made these beautiful shoes. Who do you think made those shoes? Later that day, a customer came into the shop and admired the beautiful shoes. They fit his feet so perfectly that the customer paid double the money for them. He paid more money than the price of the shoes. The shoemaker smiled at his wife. "We now have enough money to buy leather for 2 more pairs of shoes," he said happily. "There's even a little money left over to buy some food for dinner." That evening, just as before, the shoemaker cut leather for 2 pairs of shoes and left them on his workbench. As he lay in bed, he thought of how he would sew both pairs of shoes the next morning. What do you think will happen? The next morning, the shoemaker woke up and saw 2 beautiful crafted pairs of shoes waiting on his workbench. The shoemaker could hardly believe what he saw. Before long, 2 customers came to his workshop. and brought the shoes. They too were so thrilled with the shoes that they paid a handsome price, a lot of money. The shoemaker and his wife now had enough money to make 4 pairs of shoes and to buy some delicious bread for dinner. That night after dinner, the shoemaker cut the leather for 4 pairs of shoes and left it ready for the morning. He went to bed and slept well. What do you think will happen while the shoemaker is sleeping? Early the next morning, the shoemaker woke up and found 4 pairs of the most exquisite, really beautiful, nice shoes waiting on his workbench. The shoemaker had sold all 4 pairs by lunchtime. He now had enough money to make 8 more pairs of shoes and buy an apple pie for supper. He felt happier now that he wasn't so poor. And so it went on. Night after night, the shoemaker cut the leather, and in the morning, the shoes were ready to be sewed. The shoemaker puzzled and puzzled over who was making the shoes, but he could not figure it out. One evening, a few days before Christmas, the shoemaker had an idea. As he sat in front of the warm fire, he told his wife his idea. We should stay up late at night and try to discover or find out who is making those beautiful shoes, he said as the firelight flickered across his face. The shoemaker's wife agreed, so they stayed awake and hid behind a curtain. As the clock struck midnight, the shoemaker and his wife saw 2 tiny elves dressed in tattered clothes into the workshop. An elf is a small magical helper that is make believe. In this story, there are 2 elves. In the blink of an eye, they had scampered up onto the workbench. They picked up the cut leather, and began to sew it together as if by magic. Before the sun had risen, they had finished sewing the shoes. They placed them carefully on the workbench, and then they disappeared as quickly as they had come. The elves ran out into the cold, dark night with only their ragged clothes to keep them warm. The shoemaker's wife was worried about the elves. I would like to make them some nice warm clothes, she said to her husband as they ate breakfast. Perhaps you could make them some tiny leather shoes to protect their feet from the cold. The shoemaker and his wife set to work cutting and sewing the tiny clothes and shoes. That evening, after her husband had laid out the shoe leather, the shoemaker's wife placed the gifts on the bench. The tiny clothes and leather shoes looked beautiful in the lamplight. Once again, the shoemaker and his wife hid behind the curtain. At the stroke of midnight, the elves appeared. They were just about to begin their work when they noticed the gifts spread out before them. They put on their new clothes and shoes and admired each other. They thought they looked good in their new clothes. Then, as quickly as they came, they were gone. The elves never came back again, but it did not matter. The shoemaker and his wife were no longer poor. They lived happily together for the rest of their lives.